This morning's scripture reading is from Mark chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. They came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus and Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Then he sternly ordered him to be quiet. But he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately, he regained his sight and followed him on the way. Here ends today's scripture reading.
Healing was an important part of Jesus' ministry, and Jesus was a powerful healer. He was also a great storyteller, and in his ministry, these were often one and the same. His storytelling was a medium for his healing. In other words, his stories often were the medicine. As the suffering people, those who were blind, deaf, crippled, lame, spiritually empty, hemorrhaging, lepers, they all approached him. And he recognized them. Jesus recognized something within each person, and each knew that he was known more deeply than he could know himself. In Jesus' gaze, sick and broken humanity saw itself anew. Before I go on, I want to say that I want you to stretch beyond what Jesus did. Whatever it was, however it worked, which is always going to be a mystery to all of us. And think about, even in your own life, how you've been known at times and how healing that knowing is. When you can just be who you are without pretense, without trying to up somebody else or look like you're stronger than you are, and you can just be accepted for who you are. I think as you go along today, and I talk more and more about story, you might, and I hope, you begin to see yourself as part of this church in that story. I hope this is a place where you can see yourself and be known and be okay. Well, remember the Samaritan woman at the well in John's Gospel, who was astounded by the complete stranger who was able to tell her all about herself. Jesus asked the woman for a drink from the well, which startled her because, as we've talked about many times in the past, she was a Samaritan and he was a Jew. She was a woman, he was a man. They were not supposed to talk in public, or maybe at all. Then he told her about herself. He told her her own story. When the disciples appeared and the woman returned to her people, she declared to them in awe, "Come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done." We can only receive a story, as our story, as having something profound to bring to our life, if our time and the time for listening is right for us. We can't go out and tell people what we think they're supposed to know. We have to wait till they ask in some ways. This often happens, this storytelling happened like it did yesterday at Bill's service. It was really profound, and it's a little embarrassing for me to say, wow, what a great service, because it's as if I did it. But the good parts of the service, the beautiful parts, were his only son, his only child, telling the story of Bill's life in such detail that we who have known him for over 20 years, in my case, and for some of you more, felt like we knew him in a new way. And then people spoke up about him throughout the congregation. And it was beautiful. It was healing. This often happens. That's another one of our traditions. This often happens at our services. And so memorials suddenly become sort of joyful in a weird way. Those who know they needed healing throughout the Gospels, well, they approach Jesus. He doesn't seek them out. They're ready to listen and they're ready to receive their story's transforming power. The story becomes the medicine. The blind beggar on the road to Jericho cried out, "Have mercy on me." After bystanders told him to be quiet, he only cried out more loudly. He was prepared by his suffering, as some of us have noticed when we're in our sick bed. I've watched people on their deathbeds. They're prepared now to listen and to hear in a new way. The bystanders around him, they weren't ready to hear. So it was the beggar, not the able-bodied, socially acceptable people who received the blessing of healing. Jericho was already a bustling town, and it was prosperous in that day. People on the road into town had places to go, people to see. Surely their lives were richer, more significant, more worthy of a story than that of a blind beggar crying out in desperation. But Jesus chose to bring our eye level down from that promising horizon to the ground where the broken man was sitting. It's the beggar's story that got told, and it's still being told. In our passage today, we're reminded that Jesus did much of his teaching through parable. This wasn't just a clever technique. Jesus had profound trust in the healing power of parable, the richly symbolic nature of his storytelling. The gospel writer reminds us that the ancient prophets, long before Jesus, predicted the storytelling of the Christ. Quoting Isaiah, "I will open my mouth to speak in parable. I will proclaim what has been hidden from the foundation of the world." Not only the stories and the parables from Scripture, but all, in weird ways, the classic stories from ancient mythology and even the simplest folk tales can be medicine to our souls. I invite you this week, if you have any the old storybooks or some, we have sets of children's storybooks that belong to Steve's mother and he grew up on, and that kind of thing. I encourage you to look at Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, and Hansel and Gretel. Not just Disney's version, but the old stories. Fairy tales aren't just for children. These stories can mirror the interior experience of a person or even of a whole culture. In these stories, the listener might find the healing they need to guide them in the direction they need to go. The story can provide a context with simple but profound symbolism. For instance, and these aren't dictionary things where royalty means this, just like dreams. This doesn't mean this doesn't mean this. It's a part of your experience and working with the imagery of the folk tale, the mythology, the scripture. Royalty in the tales may speak of the best to be found in ourselves, our kingly nature, our queenly being. Talking animals might hold either an instinctual wisdom, more powerful than we human two-leggeds, or it could be suggesting a base instinct that we must rise above. Brides and bridegrooms can suggest the aspects of our lives in which we seek to be more deeply connected, to be more deeply wed. The trials put before the story's hero or heroine might hint at the initiations which are needed in each of our lives in order to grow and develop into what we are meant to be, the tests that we go through in life, all of us, such as raising a teenager. No, that's Maggie. What might appear to be simply tales for children, which can be left behind when we leave the nursery to get serious about life, or are actually powerful tales with layers of psychic, social, and spiritual meaning. One obviously important image or symbol in today's story of the blind beggar is the darkness itself. That's another thing. It isn't just the characters, but sometimes it's the imagery, such as darkness has its own being. Not the darkness of Bartimaeus himself, the blindness, but the message his knowing brings about the darkness of the world around him and around us. We might see this darkness as the shadow in which the soulless leaders of our world live, with confusion and excessive striving for things that have no permanence, no depth of spirit, nothing of the eternal. The things they strive for so often depend on using others and abusing others to acquire. Whole cultures, we don't have to look very far back in history to see that. They are the ones who live in the darkness, the ones who cannot see the light of the Spirit and have convinced themselves and each other that their darkened minds are the way to cleverly navigate the matters of the world. Stories lie beneath not only the events of our personal lives, what does my dream mean? What does this story mean for me? But also beneath history itself, often predicting the shared events of our time. In some ways, the movies of today were really attuned to what's happening. The Matrix, different movies, which I can't make myself watch because of the violence, but they have a huge symbolism for our time. These underlying stories can be life-affirming or life-crippling. As a culture, we've almost convinced ourselves that the force of the intellect has completely replaced the need for fertile wisdom, the wisdom of the imagination as well. So that it's awfully hard sometimes for a fact-based, bottom line kind of person to find that they can come into a church to read scriptures, to study the words and the stories of scripture, and especially the miracles and the events like that, and be true to themselves. However, the repression of the imagination will not extinguish the imagination, but will only force it to find its voice in even darker and more unconscious ways. For instance, we might ask, what is the unconscious story being lived out in our culture behind a frenzied capitalism, which feeds on lies and leads to vast wealth for a small percentage at the top of the economic ladder, while bringing greater economic hardship for most of the rest of us? The unbridled capitalism functions under a fantasy that a radical free market economy needs no regulation, that if left alone, it will regulate itself to greater wealth for all. Instead, the gap between the rich and the poor has widened obscenely. Widespread fraudulent practices which operate covertly at the highest levels of the government and corporate power don't serve the people of our country, the welfare of the nation, the health of the land on which it has been built. Our country was supposedly founded on a different story, and I think that it's still our story somewhere deeply. One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Yet those in power who remain blind to this story, which is actually guiding their actions, can blind the rest of us as well. And suddenly we succumb to this story. Yes, stories lie beneath the events of history, and I challenge all of us to look back at history, not just our own, but the history of the world, to see this. We recognize how stories can teach and comfort children, but we forget how much we adults need stories in our lives. The blind beggar in scripture could be healed because he knew he was blind. He knew he was a beggar. And in this awareness of his vulnerability, he could be welcomed into a new and more truly abundant life. When we welcome the imagination, the once upon a time, into our realistic adult lives, we at least open the path toward living happily ever after. These stories are not the playful property of children alone, but express the eternal truths of the Spirit. and the cosmos. Well, we have a story. We have a story here at First United. I'm sorry I'm the one that always is up here speaking, because I'm sure you all could say this even more profoundly. It's our stories composed of many stories woven into a whole that's become the congregation gathered here today and online, and those traveling the world right now. It's a story of beginnings and relationships and celebrations and sorrows. It's a story of the inspiration of the Gospels and the sharing of our faith. It's a story of service and learning and teaching. It's a story of generations that look backward and forward and live with trust in God in the present moment. It's the story of our stewardship, the story of giving that makes possible the worship and the counseling and the teaching and the healing and the singing and the playing that take place here year after year, generation after generation. We are indeed like the trees, planted by streams of water, which yield our fruit in season. And with God's help, we can and we will prosper, despite the disappointments and the challenges of the world around us.